Hi, I'm James Doohan. Welcome to the first volume of Star Trek episodes to be released in this, our 30th anniversary year. The Cage was originally produced in 1964 as a test, known as a pilot episode, to show the television networks what Star Trek would look like. And in later years, when the show's creator, Gene Roddenberry, was asked to comment about how he originally dreamt up the outer space concept, he cited a similar motivation to that of the author of Gulliver's Travels. Jonathan Swift had wanted to write about contemporary issues, but knew that if he dared to talk about stupid kings and crooked prime ministers, he would rapidly find himself awaiting execution. So Swift created Lilliput to write metaphorically about his times. Television in the 1960s was subject to such rigid censorship that Gene Roddenberry, too, felt it was almost impossible to create drama addressing contemporary issues. So Roddenberry created a vision of the future in which alien civilizations could suffer our problems. It was his hope that by writing about racism and civil rights on other planets, the network censors would not realize that he was presenting modern social issues. Gene was well aware that science fiction was a tough idea to sell, but equally he was convinced that it was the only way to tell the stories. In the course of his efforts to get the series produced, he resorted to telling people that it would be like Wagon Train to the Stars because of the popularity of Westerns. Finally, Desilu Studios agreed to make Star Trek, but when the network NBC saw The Cage, they were not impressed. Instead of a Western in space, they were given an intellectual drama about the perils of mind control and the immorality of imprisonment. They did, however, feel that the show had potential, given some significant changes. One specific objection was that actress Majel Barrett's character, number one, could not be second in command because she was a woman. Gene pointed out that the sexes were equal in Star Trek's era, but the network showed him some unexpected responses from females in the test audience. Far from embracing a woman in such a position of power, the general response to her was, "Who the hell does she think she is?" In an unprecedented move, the network ordered a second pilot episode. Only Leonard Nimoy as Spock remained. The captain's role was renamed Kirk and given to William Shatner. My own character, Scotty, and George Takei's Sulu made their debut with him in Where No Man Has Gone Before. I got on to Star Trek through the director, Jimmy Goldstone. I had auditioned unsuccessfully in front of him for another role just 10 days before, but something I did must have caught his eye, because he called me in on a Saturday morning for Star Trek. I was handed a script and asked to do several accents. I read the part in Russian, Irish, English, German, and Scottish voices. Gene asked me my favorite. When I suggested a Scotsman because of their engineering tradition, I even named him Scotty. All right? The tone of this second pilot is different from The Cage, containing much more action. This episode was produced during 1965 at a cost of $300,000. By early 1966, network NBC had ordered 13 episodes of Star Trek to be screened during the autumn. The first series episode to be produced, The Corbomite Maneuver, began filming on May 24, 1966. It introduced DeForest Kelley as Dr. McCoy and Grace Lee Whitney as Yeoman Rand. Both had been in another but unsuccessful Gene Roddenberry pilot, known as Police Story. Rounding out our crew complement was Nichelle Nichols as Uhura. Having been asked to remove the female character of number one, Gene was determined to sneak another woman onto the bridge as a high-ranking officer. Better than that, he managed to cast her from a second ethnic minority.
Hi, I'm George Takei. Welcome to Volume 1.2 of our 30th anniversary release of Star Trek. My association with Star Trek began when I was cast in the role of biophysicist Sulu for the second pilot. I was given less than a day to prepare for the interview, and as a consequence, the first thing I did when I walked into the production office was to ask to see Gene Roddenberry. He, in turn, mispronounced my name, calling me Takei. I told him that Takei was a legitimate Japanese word meaning expensive. He swiftly called me Takei. Despite our mutual gaffes, I enjoyed the interview with Gene greatly. Here was a potential for a television role that would really make a difference. An Asian in a position of seniority and working in concert with a team that represented our global diversity. It was a vision of a better future and a bold step for television in the mid-60s. I remained on tenterhooks for several days until I finally got the call telling me I had the part. Between the pilot and the series, Sulu was moved to the bridge as helmsman. After all, not every episode would need a biophysicist, but they were going to need someone to fly the ship every week. Our first episode on this volume is the hugely entertaining Mudd's Women. The script was written by Stephen Candle from an outline of Gene's and intended to be the second pilot. Submission was delayed by the writer's illness, so it then became the second episode in the first series. We followed this with The Enemy Within. It includes our first view of Scotty's engineering level, the first use of the Vulcan nerve pinch, and the first appearance of Kirk's casual wraparound uniform. In the story, Kirk is split between two people, one good, the other evil. Sulu is stranded on a sub-zero temperature planet where he displays remarkable courage and even retains his sense of humor despite the grave situation. I only wished that the writers had invented the shuttlecraft during this episode because it would have made Sulu's rescue a whole lot easier. The episode also sees the first real beginnings of the Kirk-McCoy-Spock triumvirate. The combination was a dramatic device which DeForest Kelley had seen in earlier writings by Gene Roddenberry. For example, in the police story pilot, Kelley played a criminologist next to two detectives. He describes the relationship his character had with one of the detectives as being very like that which developed between McCoy and Kirk. Star Trek was always an expression of tolerance and reason. Extremism was something to be avoided, with Spock having the cool, logical voice of reason and McCoy representing the passionately emotional human. Kirk in the middle gave the balance and stability, wisely choosing the best path to reconcile the two opposites. Our last episode on the cassette is Man Trap, which was for various reasons the first to be televised. Transmitted on Thursday, September 8, 1966 at 8:30 p.m., it was greeted with very mixed reactions. Show business's most famous trade magazine, Variety, called it a dreary mass of confusion and said William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy appeared wooden. Our specific pilot point was that the monster craves salt in order to live. In a scene to illustrate this, the monster tries to grab a salt cellar from Sulu's lunch tray. The props department made suitably futuristic salt cellars, which looked great but might have been difficult to recognize as such on screen. Anxious to make clear the creature's intentions, a more conventional-looking salt cellar was substituted. It was then decided to use the futuristic ones in another role, as the medical instruments used by Dr. McCoy. Hi, I'm George Takei. Welcome to Volume 1.3 of Star Trek, which is being released to celebrate our 30th anniversary year. Our first episode, The Naked Time, is one of my personal favorites. Writer John D.F. Black came to see me and explained he wanted a scene in which Sulu went berserk. He could not decide whether Sulu's weapon should be a samurai sword or a fencing foil. I suggested the fencing foil because by the 23rd century, a man's cultural heritage should be greater than just his ethnicity. John agreed and wrote me some marvelous scene in a powerfully dramatic story. I fitted in some fencing lessons with the teacher Ralph Faulkner, who had choreographed the swordplay for Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone in The Adventures of Robin Hood. During the filming of the episode, I would practice in secluded corners of the set. One day I was rehearsing behind a piece of scenery when Jimmy Doohan came to find out what my grunting noises were. Just as I had lunged forward, he materialized in front of me and my blade missed his nose by inches. Within minutes, word was broadcast throughout the set that I had attacked Jimmy. This wildly exaggerated story must have been believable because William Shatner once said that the fear in his eyes as I faced him on the bridge was not acting. The naked time really drew out the characters which we were all trying so hard to create. In the scene where Spock loses control of his emotions, Leonard turned in a brilliant performance in a single take. Bill's scene, where he realizes he too has caught the disease, is outstanding. Charlie X, our next episode, was a debut script from one of our best writers on the show, Dorothy Fontana. I had first met Dorothy when I reported to the Star Trek office for my audition interview, because then she was Gene Roddenberry's secretary. She is a lady gifted with considerable writing talent. Charlie X was one of a dozen or so story ideas which Gene had included in a written document outlining Star Trek's promise as a television show. Dorothy took that idea and wrote an excellent script from the concept. Working as Gene's secretary, she had been involved in every stage in the creation of Star Trek, and with this story, she displays a laudable understanding of the show's characters and themes. In due course, Dorothy became Star Trek's story editor. Balance of Terror was an important episode for us. Gene never liked to have bad guys for the sake of bad guys. All of our adversaries were as real and three-dimensional as possible. They should have a reason and a motivation which caused conflict. The writer of this episode, Paul Schneider, was charged with the job of creating a set of admirable villains. Were the antagonists and Kirk's equal? Schneider postulated the Romulans, a civilization based upon the Roman Empire, but extended in their technological development to the point of space travel. He then developed a storyline with Gene Roddenberry, which was essentially a retelling of a World War II submarine story. The episode also dealt with prejudice and living with the face of the enemy. In the story, the Romulans are discovered to have the appearance of Vulcans, and one of the human officers, Mr. Stiles, begins to treat Spock as if he too were the enemy. Welcome back to Star Trek's 30th Anniversary Celebration video releases. I'm George Takei, and I would like to share some background history with you. You are seeing the episodes in the sequence they were filmed, but when they were originally shown on television, some were transmitted in different order. Sometimes this was because of technical problems with finishing the special effects, and occasionally it was for dramatic reasons. We didn't always film the episodes in the order they were commissioned, and the star dates got out of sequence. Star dates had been invented because Gene did not want to tie Star Trek down to a specific future time. Unfortunately, fans of the show tried to keep track of the star dates and rapidly realized that they did not follow any set pattern. They wrote in asking for an explanation. Fearing that the real answer would destroy their suspension of disbelief, Gene came up with the following. This time system adjusts for shifts in relative time which occur due to the vessel's speed and space warp capability. It has little relationship to Earth's time as we know it. 1 hour aboard the USS Enterprise at different times may equal as little as 3 Earth hours. The star date specified in the log entry must be computed against the speed of the vessel, the space warp, and its position within our galaxy in order to give a meaningful reading. Confused? Even Gene admitted he wasn't quite sure what he meant, but it certainly stopped people asking any more. Shortly after we finished the first story on this tape, What Are Little Girls Made Of?, Gene Roddenberry attended a science fiction convention. He wanted to give the enthusiasts there a glimpse of Star Trek before we were on air. Gene took a copy of the second pilot episode, Where No Man Has Gone Before, and some costumes, because the convention was putting on a futuristic fashion show. When he arrived in Cleveland, he was taken to meet the woman who was organizing the models, and she was having a bad day. There was no way she was going to rearrange her fashion show just because some pushy Hollywood producer wanted to show his costumes. Not to be dissuaded, Gene took her for a coffee and gradually charmed her until she gave in. When questioned about the night, she remembers most vividly that one of the costumes was from What Are Little Girls Made Of? The model who wore it spent the entire evening beating off men with a stick. Our next episode on this volume is Dagger of the Mind. It is an intense thriller about mind control and heralded the introduction of the Vulcan mind meld. The pace of work on Star Trek, as it is on any television show, was grueling. We worked long hours and took intense pride in what we were creating. We were joined on this episode by guest star Morgan Woodward as Van Gelder. Not only did he have to struggle against straitjacket and confinement, but he had to run an emotional gauntlet, too, with lots of crying, yelling, and screaming. Reportedly, when he finished filming the episode, he went home and had to rest for 4 days. Our final episode is the story Miri, another treatment of the perils of childhood and, particularly, our teenage years. In the first draft, writer Adrian Spees had written a much closer relationship between Janice Rand and Kirk than the way it finally appeared on the screen.
Hi, I'm James Doohan, and I'm here to introduce Volume 1.5 of Star Trek episodes, being released to celebrate our show's 30th anniversary. The Conscience of the King was the final episode in which Yeoman Rand appeared. This episode was a murder mystery which featured a group of actors performing Shakespeare aboard the Enterprise. Our costume designer, William Ware Tice, came up with another of his glamorous creations for our guest actress, Barbara Anderson, to almost wear. She reported it as being held together by spit and glue. The episode, The Galileo 7, is an important study of Spock and the need to leap beyond logic in certain situations. The story for this show came from Oliver Crawford. He thought the 1939 movie Five Came Back was ripe for a science fiction retelling. In the original, a plane crashed in the Andes, and the survivors had to contend with headhunters who lived over the next hill. This show also holds a place in Star Trek history because it is the first to feature the shuttlecraft. Star Trek had set up a deal with the AMT Corporation, whereby AMT had paid for the rights to market a plastic model kit of the USS Enterprise. They also set up a second deal. This stated that AMT would construct a full-sized interior and exterior of a shuttlecraft. Star Trek would then use them as a set in exchange for granting permission to AMT to build and market further plastic kits, this time of the shuttlecraft. The estimated cost of the shuttlecraft was $65,000, but when you consider that AMT is still marketing Star Trek model kits, it was money invested wisely. Incidentally, the shuttlecraft is now owned by a fan of the show, who lovingly restored it and displays it at Star Trek conventions. Don M. Mankiewicz was contacted by our producer, Gene L. Kuhn, and asked to write the next episode. Gene explained to him that they needed a compelling story which could be filmed in a simple and easily constructed set. Mankiewicz immediately came up with the idea of a courtroom drama because a lot of the action could happen in one place. The writer had scripted several courtroom dramas for other television series in the past, so he was well aware of the dynamics of such a story. His original script was titled Court Martial on Starbase 11. Mankiewicz was unable to perform the rewrites because he had to leave town on other business. The story was then turned over to Stephen Karabatsos, who was our story editor at the time. He shortened the title to simply Court Martial, revised it, and changed the location to Starbase 12. Hi, I'm James Doohan, and I'm here to introduce Volume 1.6 of our 30th anniversary Star Trek episodes. Star Trek was so complicated to film that it was having problems sticking to schedule. Now, even before they started filming the series episodes, Gene Roddenberry and associate producer Robert Justman were aware that completing episodes on time was going to be difficult. Gene began to wonder how he could relieve the shooting schedule a little, and his thoughts drifted back to the first pilot episode, The Cage. When it became obvious that television network NBC was not going to buy a series based on The Cage, Gene had started to plan to recoup some of the money spent on it. At the time, it was the most expensive pilot ever filmed, costing about $600,000. Gene's first plan had been to extend The Cage into a feature film and release it in cinemas. This could have been done in one of two ways. Either putting back scenes which had been cut, but this might slow the pace and ruin the story, or shooting new material to build it up. Perhaps they could have shown the disastrous mission, which had predated the events of The Cage, but only referred to in the story. One problem with this second idea was that Jeffrey Hunter, who had portrayed Captain Pike, was not interested in reprising his performance. Abandoning the feature film idea altogether, and with the most remarkable leap of imagination, Gene came up with the story of The Menagerie. Set on our Enterprise, but referring back to the mission shown in The Cage, flashbacks from that pilot would be used. Star Trek could produce a two-part episode for little more effort than it took to produce a single hour-long show and solve the problem of what to do with the unsold pilot. The new story required the presence of Captain Pike, but the fact that he was to have been tragically injured allowed the production team to sidestep the Jeffrey Hunter problem. The producers simply cast a new actor, Sean Kenny, in the role. He bore an uncanny facial resemblance to Hunter, and once he was made up to look injured, he became indistinguishable. The disfiguring makeup required 5 hours to apply. As part of it, Kenny's hair was dyed white, but proved to be too bright for the cameras, so it was dulled with beige powder. All of this was quite a baptism of fire for Kenny because Star Trek was his first professional job as an actor. Shore Leave was filmed on location at Africa, USA, a 1,000-acre ranch on which lions, tigers, elephants, and other exotic animals were kept. Theodore Sturgeon had turned in a brilliant first draft script which spun a tale of fantasy and science fiction. The network were concerned that it was too fantasy-oriented and the script needed to be rewritten. As Sturgeon had moved on to another project and Gene Roddenberry had left town for a week, the story was handed over to Gene L. Kuhn. Somehow, the memo about playing down the fantasy elements was lost, and he turned in an undeniably brilliant story, but one which played up the fantasy. When Gene Roddenberry returned from his trip, we were just beginning to film. Then he saw the script, and he realized that even more and very rapid rewriting was in order. At the end of the first day's frantic writing and shooting, there was a round-table session in a local restaurant, both to restore the script to the tone of the original draft and to make it filmable on our budget.
Welcome to Volume 1.7 of Star Trek Episodes. I'm George Takei, and I'd like to share some memories about these episodes with you. Writer Paul Schneider had the inspiration for the Squire of Gothos while thinking about children who play at being soldiers and making war. In essence, the story is an anti-war statement with a twist ending. The character Trelane was a dramatic role which demanded a particularly talented actor to pull it off successfully. Gene L. Kuhn had a feeling he knew the perfect actor for the job, but met with resistance from our casting advisor, Joe DaGusta, who wanted Roddy McDowell for the role. Undeterred, Gene contacted his choice, William Campbell, and arranged for him to audition. Instead of reading them the set pages of the script, Bill took the bit between his teeth and launched into one of Trelane's lengthy monologues. He got through just one paragraph before he was cut off by Joe capitulating and saying they should go straight to wardrobe. Bill was perfect for the part. The second story on this tape was a perfect example of Gene Roddenberry's desire to tell the best stories around. Frederick Brown had written a short story called Arena. It came to the production staff's attention that it was ripe for retelling in the Star Trek context, so they purchased the rights. Gene Kuhn expertly rewrote the show into a compelling adventure as Kirk finds himself struggling between his life as a diplomat and as a military man. The scene in which Kirk refuses to conclude the duel is one of the best summations of our show's philosophy. If you watch closely, you will notice actor Sean Kenny in the role of Navigator, Lieutenant DePaul. Sean had appeared in Star Trek only 2 weeks before as the disabled Captain Pike in the two-part episode, The Menagerie. He had worked under so much makeup in that role, however, that when he stepped onto the set as DePaul, nobody recognized him. The final episode on this volume is titled The Alternative Factor, which was very nearly scrapped at the last minute and never made at all. We began shooting the episode in November 1966, and the guest star was actor John Drew Barrymore. But after lunch on the first day of filming, John didn't return to the set. A search was mounted, but nobody could find him anywhere. Anxious of the time which was being wasted, our director Gert Oswald began to shoot footage which did not require the absent actor. When John did not show up for a second day's shooting, we suddenly realized that we were in trouble. The decision was almost taken to cut our losses and scrap the episode, but in a desperate attempt to find a replacement, a studio representative was dispatched immediately to Robert Brown's house. It was Robert's birthday that day, but he was literally dragged off to the set as soon as he agreed to play the part. We were almost 2 days behind out of a 6-day shooting schedule when Robert stepped before the cameras to assume the role of Lazarus. The whole episode was shot in a whirlwind rush. Robert remembers the set as a very tense place for those few hectic days. But if it had not been for Robert, this episode would never have been made. Hi, 1996 is Star Trek's 30th anniversary year. I'm George Takei, and I would like to introduce Volume 1.8 of Star Trek Episodes to you. Tomorrow is Yesterday was Dorothy Fontana's second script for Star Trek and our first real foray into time travel. After her first Star Trek script, Charlie X, had proved so successful, Dorothy decided to try writing scripts full-time. She handed in her notice as secretary to Gene Roddenberry and began to write in earnest. This story had grown out of the episode The Naked Time. At the climax of that episode, the Enterprise and her crew found themselves moving backwards through time. The intention had been to jumpstart a second part to that episode in which the crew would have found themselves in some past era. Before he could write Part 2, however, author John D.F. Black was offered a motion picture deal at Universal and left Star Trek to pursue that opportunity. Dorothy began playing with the time travel idea and decided she wanted to show that by accidentally traveling back to the 60s, the crew of the Enterprise were like fish out of water. In particular, she determined that every correct Starfleet decision Captain Kirk made throughout the episode was going to place him deeper and deeper into trouble. Star Trek hung under the constant threat of cancellation during the whole time we were making the series. Joe Pevney remembers that while he was directing our next episode, The Return of the Archons, the message came down from the front office saying Star Trek was definitely being renewed for more episodes. Pevney says that as soon as we heard this, the two stars of our show, Bill Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, wanted to make more contributions to the writing of their characters. He recalls that at the rehearsal table around which we had script read-throughs, they came up with many suggested changes. Anything which was changed had to be cleared by the writing staff in the production office. Pevney remembers that the delays caused by this sometimes made the shooting schedule even harder to achieve. The name Archons came from Gene's past. It was a name of a service club to which he had belonged during the late 30s, early 40s, while attending Los Angeles City College. A subplot in which Officer Lindstrom falls in love with one of the planet's inhabitants was cut from the final version, although you do hear him voice concern about her fate during the Red Hour. If you watch closely, you will also see one scene in which Spock is apparently sleeping with his eyes open as if in a meditative trance. This episode is the first one in which Kirk talks a computer to death. The last episode, A Taste of Armageddon, is a cleverly written story which contains overtones of America's involvement in Vietnam. As a statement against that involvement, this episode postulated two planets who were at war with one another. Instead of dropping real bombs, it was all fought out using computers, and the calculated victims had to report for execution. Gene L. Kuhn rewrote Robert Hammer's first draft script so that the power of the episode's message was emphasized. In particular, Kirk's final speech was deemed the one which really sold the story, and Gene wrote it over and over again, trying to hone it to perfection. Our guest actor, David Opatoshu, who was chosen to play Anan 7, was immediately drawn to the role. He felt strongly about the madness of letting computers govern warfare. Interestingly enough, David had been one of the actors Gene Roddenberry had seriously considered when he was casting for The Cage. David had been in the running for the role of Ship's Doctor. Welcome to Volume 1.9 of Star Trek Episodes, released to celebrate our 30th anniversary year. I'm George Takei, and I'd like to tell you a little about the episodes you are about to watch. Space Seed featured Khan Noonien Singh, played by guest star Ricardo Montalban. He says that even on the page, Khan was fascinating and larger than life, thanks to the work of writer Carrie Wilbur and producer Gene L. Kuhn. At the end of the episode, Spock states that it would be interesting to return to Khan's world in the future to see what had become of his people. Kirk's reply in the original script was that he hoped Khan and his followers would not come looking for them. Unfortunately, this line was cut, but history has proved it to be prophetic. In the early 80s, when film producer Harv Bennett was planning the second Star Trek motion picture, he watched every episode of the original series. When he got to Space Seed, the character of Khan stuck in his mind, and he developed the story which became Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. For our next episode, writer Jerry Soule began to wonder what it would be like if everyone on the Enterprise took LSD. His script, entitled The Way of the Spores, dealt with this theme by having the crew infected with malevolent plant spores. It featured Sulu having a love affair But the story just did not want to work. Gene Roddenberry felt it was necessary to turn the story over to a new writer. He called Dorothy Fontana and asked whether she would be interested in rewriting it. As an extra incentive, he told her that if she did it fast and well, he would back her to become Star Trek's story editor. Stephen Karabatsos was just about to leave, and Gene knew that Dorothy was interested in the post. She took the script and completely reworked it as This Side of Paradise. Unfortunately for me, she decided that the officer having the love affair should be Spock, not Sulu. She wrote a wonderful script containing a beautiful love story which deepened Spock's character. Regrettably, the one person who disliked her script was Jerry Soule. Although he retained the story credit, he ultimately decided to use his pseudonym, Nathan Butler. As far as the production office was concerned, Dorothy's work had been exceptional, and she was appointed Star Trek's new script editor. In 1965, there was an episode of The Outer Limits called The Probe. As was the tradition on that series, each story featured a monster, and in this one, it was described as an overgrown microorganism. The creature was made by Janos Prohaska, who one day demonstrated his creation to a group of us from Star Trek, including Gene L. Kuhn. His outrageous demonstration involved the creature devouring a chicken carcass to leave only a skeleton behind. Well, Gene was so inspired, he immediately began writing a story around the monster. Kuhn's inspiration was right on, and he wrote one of our best episodes, The Devil in the Dark. With hindsight, years after the series was over, Gene Roddenberry stated that he felt this was also a very important episode. It made such an important statement. Just because something is ugly, it does not mean it is bad or dangerous. Although the monster costume was excellent, when it was taken to the set, there were some problems. The Horta, as it was known, was the same color as the rocks, obviously because it was supposed to be a rock creature. Unfortunately, when director Joe Pevney tried to photograph it, it simply blended into the cave walls of the set and became indistinguishable. In order to try to make it stand out, they tried to give it a wet sheen and then exaggerated its movements.
Welcome to Volume 1.10 of Star Trek. I'm James Doohan, and I'd like to introduce the episode you are about to watch. Our producer, Gene L. Kuhn, was hitting a creative high with Star Trek by this stage in our run. He followed The Devil and the Dark with Errand of Mercy, which is remembered because it introduced the Klingons. Kirk's counterpart in the Klingon Empire was Commander Kor, and when John Newland was signed to direct the episode, he immediately suggested John Colicos for the part. Colicos was living in Toronto at the time and remembers that the script arrived at his home about 2 hours before he was due to be at the airport to travel to Hollywood. He learned his lines on the plane, and upon landing, went straight to makeup, where Fred Phillips, our makeup artist, confessed that he really did not know what a Klingon was supposed to look like. Nothing in the script had given a clue. John explained that he viewed the script as an allegory of the Cold War between America and Russia, and with that in mind, Fred began experimenting with an Eastern European look for the character. Then, drawing inspiration from the past, John remembers suggesting that Kor be given an appearance which resembled Genghis Khan. His hair was already cropped short and combed forwards, and they decided to spray it black. Finally, they agreed that his skin tone should be brown-green to get away from a human complexion. All the other Klingons were then made up more or less around this basic pattern, and the Klingon look, which prevailed throughout the series, was born. Director Joe Pevney described our next episode, The City on the Edge of Forever, as essentially a motion picture. The story was breathtaking in scope, but sadly, Controversy surrounded its writing. Author Harlan Ellison supplied the first draft script for this show, which, whilst being an excellent story, contained some problems. In common with a lot of our first drafts, it was too expensive to film. Secondly, Kirk was not true to the character which had been established in previous episodes. The script was then revised by the production staff. Then, network NBC insisted that Kirk's line, "Let's get the hell out of here," had to be changed. They felt the word hell was too strong. Considering everything Kirk undergoes in this story, hell now seems rather mild to express what he must have been feeling. Operation Annihilate was our last show to be filmed during Star Trek's first season. If you look carefully during the brief scene in which we see Kirk's brother, you will notice that Samuel is also portrayed by William Shatner to try to maintain a family resemblance. This was very nearly our last ever Star Trek episode. Network NBC were very concerned that our show was not performing well enough in the ratings. By contrast, the fan mail which arrived at Desilu every day seemed to indicate that we were a very popular show. And towards the latter half of our first season, rumors of cancellation had begun again to drift through the sets and the offices. It was while Harlan Ellison was working on his script for The City on the Edge of Forever that he decided Star Trek was worth helping. He contacted the Science Fiction Writers Association of America to warn them that their members would lose a potential market if the show were canceled. As a result, many writers wrote in to explain why television needed a quality science fiction show. Simultaneously, a number of the show's fans had become aware that Star Trek was under threat. Demonstrations protesting against the show's demise were organized by students at Caltech and MIT. Although finding it hard to believe that the show could command such devotion, NBC renewed us for a second year.